Hello, how are you guys doing? You guys doing good? You guys ready for some creepypasta? Some scary stories? Is this gonna come with the hard R word? It shouldn't. I have not read this story in a while. If it does, then we're skipping that word. Because that's a good way to get your content demonetized, and for someone to make a call-out post, and for you to get doxxed. It's really great how the internet has given us the nice things. Anyway, this is a great story. I remember this one scaring the shit out of me when I first heard of it. I also see the Russian sleep experiment on the sidebar. Oh man. And Lavender Town Syndrome. These are classics. I'm looking at the Creepypasta wiki. But anyway, I remember this one being good. I don't remember exactly what happens in it. So, no real content warning aside from it's a creepypasta and it's scary and bad things happen to good people for no good reason. I remember those being things. Classic creepypasta. The showers. Let me go ahead and set the moon. I'm just going to read, yeah. First time coming to a rev stream. This is a little bit of a tangential thing that I've been doing recently. Let's get a little bit of rain going. There you go. Just a nice little backdrop. Does it have a source? A author? There's no author credit on this. I'm finding it on creepypasta.fandom.com/wiki/the_showers. Someone wrote this. Don't know who. A little bit of cozy vibes for a scary strum. Someone wrote it, I'm sure. Anyway, the showers, part 1. Every area in all parts of the world has those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of the city, a creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts the lonely stretch of the road outside town, there's always a common thread with those tales. No one has ever been to these places, seen these creatures, or witnessed any of these hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who proclaim that they know someone whose brother's best friend's sister went to that haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood and snakes and spiders, and it was so scary that no one has ever made it all the way through. Those same people will swear by those stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence or a name of someone who could provide proof of these claims, simply because everyone around here just knows it's a true story. Storytellers eventually pass their tales on to their children, who modify them just enough to keep up with the changing times, and the cycle continues. I'm as skeptical as anyone when it comes to these stories. Seeing as I was a junkie when I was younger, constantly searching for terrifying stories, whatever area of the country I was living in at the time, I made up and spread stories about haunted pizza parlors in New York, my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or how my grandfather encountered a feral, human-like demon creature in the woods of Colorado. I even broke one of the rules of these stories by putting myself in them. Took guts in hindsight, because I had to make sure that I always told them the same way. Surprisingly, no one ever called my bluff. I like to think that I've had some wonderful contributions to various urban legends around the Midwest and the northeastern states. I moved around a lot. There was always a surge of joy whenever I would wander the halls of a school and hear one of my classmates retelling my stories to another one of their friends, adding a little bits here and there, like a massive game of telephone. I knew, of course, that these stories were complete fiction, but I stood my ground whenever someone asked me about them. I would even manage to act a little bit, speaking with a shaky voice or scared when I would recount a situation I supposedly experienced myself. I suppose the aspect of my childhood has led to my current predicament, which I will recount in full for the internet to take from it what they will. I have laid this little introduction out as a sort of disclaimer, aimed particularly at those who call my story into question. I have been like the boy who cried wolf for years, but I assure you, with every ounce of honesty and integrity that I have, that this time the wolf is real. From my introduction, it was probably apparent that I moved around the country quite a bit in middle and high school years. Neither of my parents had anything to do with the branch. Neither of my parents had anything to do with the branch of the armed forces. They just simply didn't want to hang around any place for too long. Suppose that had some sort of effect on me, but I wasn't hurt by it or anything, just of the sort. Growing up, I was a complete ham. I made friends very easily. I was often the class clown. And because of that, I was often disliked by my teachers. Again, this was never an issue, as I was usually in another state by the time the next semester rolled round. My friendships were often fleeting, as were any positive relationships I ever had with my teachers. Because of the events that followed, my memory of one of my teachers in particular is probably slightly skewed, but I will give an attempt at the least biased version of our friendship that I can. Mr. Mays was one of Billy Mays here. Sorry. I saw that and I was like, is this like, did someone edit this to make it Mays? I didn't remember that being a thing. Anyway, was one of my social studies teachers in the early years of my high school experience. Being older now, I can understand how horrible children are to deal with around that age. I respect him to no end for the way he was able to connect with his students. He seemed like one of us. He talked like us. He made pop culture references that were current, listened to cool music, and sometimes he would even say hell or damn while he was giving a passionate lecture about Native American history or something like that. A teacher that swore, even a little bit, was the epitome of cool to a freshman in high school. My memories of Billy... excuse me. I did it again. My memories of Mr. Mays mostly stem from the way he got into really anything that he was doing. The instance that is still very vivid in my mind, of course, is around Halloween of my sophomore year. Mr. Mays had the typical teacher decorations around the classroom, smiling jack-o'-lanterns, black cat cartoons, typical boring in the minds of egotistical high school students. However, on the 31st of October, when most of the teachers were rolling our eyes at the fact that teenagers were still dressing up in costumes on Halloween seriously, Mr. Mays took the whole cool teacher thing to a new level. We walked into a classroom and were surprised to find the blinds drawn, sheet over the smaller windows, candles lighting the room, and a single frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting in the stool in the front of the desk. And Mr. Mays sat on his desk just watching the students come into the class and take their seats. He didn't ask anyone to be quiet because at the moment everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about their petty conversations or too confused to bother with them. Students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood. He took a seat on a chair right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. Today is probably my favorite day of the year, class, he said in a monotonous tone. I don't even have to do a voice. It's just my regular-ass voice. Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I want to share with you exactly why I love it so much. One girl raised her hand with a concerned look on her face. I'm pushing the due date for your papers back to next Tuesday, said Mr. Mays, without bothering to look at the girl who slowly put her hand down, looking around at the other students with a hint of embarrassment. The class erupted in quiet cheers as Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story immediately after the class had calmed down. I will attempt to recreate the amazing story that Mr. Mays told to the class that day. The way that he told this story rendered the horror junkies speechless, and the rest of the class terrified. The same girl that had raised her hand to ask about the paper was holding her knees to her chest by the end of it, a look of terror on her face. The important thing to know was what the story was about. Specifics slip my mind and aren't too relevant. I'll try to recount the parts of the story that matter the most, but don't hold me to it. Basically, Mr. Mays and his friends set out on a road trip across the country after graduating from college. They took a truck, loaded it with camping gear, set out to see the sights, to sightsee for the entire summer. The group went from the Poconos in New Jersey down to the coast of Florida, New Orleans, to California up to Washington. From there, they went to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and then back home to New York. The concept of freedom to travel anywhere had the class hooked in an instant. Mr. Mays was the coolest teacher ever in my eyes. Shoe Plastic, thank you for the 3 months of support. Being adventurous college children, the group didn't bring a map, no time constraints, so they just kind of drove in the general direction they wanted to go and eventually found a town to stay in or someplace that looked interesting. He told us that after spending a week in Colorado, he and his friends had traveled miles and miles of corn and plains and more corn, and he assumed that they were either in Nebraska or Kansas when they decided to pool their extra cash and stay in a hotel for the night. They settled for a motel in some town that Mr. Mays could barely remember the name of when his friends realized that they were somewhere near his grandfather's farm. He wasn't entirely sure where it was, but being adventurous college kids, they decided to take a quick refund from the motel and try to contact the friend's grandpa. They were unable to get a hold of the grandpa on the phone, so the group just figured they would just be fun to show up. Mr. May's friends was adamant that his grandparents would take them in and feed them without a moment's hesitation. So the group set out with an hour of sunlight, seeking the salvation of a comfortable house to stay in. In Kansas or Nebraska, wherever it may have been, there wasn't a whole lot of natural markers that could guide lost travelers. Any direction given to someone who didn't live in the area basically amounted to go a couple miles to the corn, take a right down the dirt road to the other corn. There should be some wheat on your right. So, as the case with many scary stories, the group got lost. Never wanting to admit defeat, they just drove into the night, making wrong turns every 5 minutes until they found themselves on a wooded road that Mr. May's friend was certain that his grandparents lived off of. Mr. Mays described the road as basically a dark path to hell. Wasn't entirely sure how true this was because he got very excited and a bit ridiculous with his explanations of the trees almost tried to grab the car and the red eyes of countless animals looking at them from the darkness. Regardless, the typical horror tropes worked on most of the class. Everyone was terrified. So the group of guys drove the dark road for about 15 minutes before they came to a clearing and a small building with lights in it, what seemed to be a silo. They figured that, in the very least, the people who lived here would be able to help them find where the guy's grandparents lived. The whole idea of everyone knows everyone in these hick parts of this country fueled this hope. They pulled the car into a nearby building, realizing when they were out of the car that it appeared to be the kind of place where one would store a bunch of chickens, not a home. Still, the lights were on, so they figured they'd give it a try. They approached the building as a group, looking into the semi-open sliding doors to find a big empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights lit the room like it was daytime. They couldn't see a soul. There were no cars, but one of Mr. Mays' friends was convinced that he had seen someone as they pulled up. So they decided to go inside and see if there was an office or somewhere where someone might be still working. Why else would they have a huge place lit up like that? Pingal. Really, guys? Really? Kind of takes away from the horror if I'm just saying Pingal every 5 seconds. Let's see. There were no doors on the inside of the building. Again, it was just a giant empty hall. So the group roamed around the property and towards the silo, and as they got closer, they noticed what appeared to be a cellar door. At this point, I remember Mr. Mays telling the class to learn from his idiocy. He told us that he had seen many horror movies before that time. He didn't think twice about approaching this creepy cellar door in the middle of a dark, scary, foreign place. He approached that door. He said that approaching that door was one of his biggest regrets. Pingal. Mr. Mays let the whole class know that he was going to tell them as much as he deemed appropriate about the experience. He felt like we were mature enough to handle it, but advised anyone who's squeamish to leave class early. Several students quietly gathered their things and walked out the door, a couple of them being stoners who saw this as an opportunity to smoke some behind the school before the next class. I didn't give the announcement a second thought. Like I said, I'm a sucker for this kind of stuff, and Mr. Mays was telling the story better than anyone I had ever conjured up. I wanted to learn from this guy, even though I didn't believe much of the story. When the class had thinned out a bit, Mr. Mays continued the story. He told the remaining students that he and his friends opened that cellar door, releasing a smell that he described as the most putrid thing that my senses had ever experienced. The group was no longer concerned about finding the owners of the property, but now set out to find the source of that smell. So they went down the steps into the cellar. which was lit by single bulbs spaced sporadically along the ceiling of a long hallway. No one spoke. Things had gotten too strange. The walls were lined with metal sheeting, similar to the roofing on farms. The hallways itself were crooked, and the ceilings were constantly lowering, raising, like the tunnel was hastily dug and then never touched up. There were sections where the boys had to almost crouch in order to pass. The worst part, Mr. Mays told us, was the light bulbs continuously flickering, sometimes acted like a strobe light, making it difficult to move through the wandering and unstable hallways. In hindsight, he was certain that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he remembered seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. He said that when you are focused on some time, or focus for some time, or even if you are that nervous, that your mind can do that to you. It can just simply revolt and show you things and people that aren't there. Continued to describe the hallway. I was on the edge of my seat. The halls were windy and seemed to go on forever. Mr. Mays guessed that there were somewhere under the creepy forest that they had driven through when they found that door, but he couldn't be sure. You should read Nate as Snake. Is Nate even in this? What do you mean, Nate? He said that they came upon a door after walking what felt like a mile, simple and wooden, and it looked like it belonged outside of a suburban home. It had a nice sign and seemed to be freshly painted red, and had a very nice knob and knocker on it. It was that door that belonged to the entrance to the nice house. It was a door that belonged to the entrance of a nice house, not one that would be sitting in a dirt tunnel in the middle of nowhere. His friends walked towards the door, moving carefully because the flashing light bulb increasing uncertainty and stability of the surrounding walls. He turned to his group, and the rest of which were nervous at the very least, and attempted to lighten the mood with a laugh before he said, "I should probably knock first." Mr. May's friends grabbed the steel knocker and hit the door several times, mockingly, but quietly uttering, "Is anyone home?" The group waited about 30 seconds before the tension broke. The guy next to the door shrugged his shoulders and then went back to his friends. But as he did, the light bulb between them surged and exploded. The boys shielded their eyes and looked back to their lone friend by the door. As he lowered his hands, one of the metal sheets of the makeshift roof dropped. The edge of the sheet dropped directly into the boy's forehead, slicing it open and sending waves of blood down his face. The impact apparently knocked him out, and he fell against the door, knocking it open in the process. The entirety of the group rushed through the dim light to their friend, barely noticing the seemingly pitch-black room that now lay behind or before them. Mr. Mays was the first to make it to his friend's side. He lifted the guy's head into his arms, immediately taking off his jacket and putting over his forehead to attempt to stop the bleeding. Once the group had calmed down, Mr. Mays noticed that his arm had been bracing his friend's head was soaking wet. He was confused about this and was attempting to sort it out when the friend started talking. And he said something along the lines of, "The lights, we have to go." When Mr. Mays took notice. "You know when you turn off a light," he told the class, "it's almost pitch black except for the light of the bulb dying or out or cooling down. It was like that. There were so many of them. At least 20 bulbs had lit the room seconds ago, and now only looked like little stars in the darkness. It was definitely terrifying, but that wasn't the scariest thing. And the very dim light coming from the hallway behind them, and though it was weak, it lit up the room just enough for the shape of tens of people standing less than 10 feet in front of them." Mr. Mays and his friends went to say something else as one of the bulbs to their right flickered to life. Let me interrupt at this point to say that Mr. Mays was generally a playful guy, but the tone of voice that makes you want to respond. Basically, you could say, "Let's go jump off a cliff, guys." And you would respond right with, "All right, Mr. Mays, show us the way." Not as a ridiculous statement, but he gets the point across. He was a charming guy. The whole story up till this point had been told like a campfire story. He had the voice inflections of someone attempting to be mysterious and scary, which worked, but was rarely noticeable. At this point in his tale, I recall that changing completely. He was no longer attempting to spook anyone. I could tell that this section was difficult for him. Either he was a very good actor or this is an actually very terrifying memory for him to relive. He told us that the light bulbs came to life and illuminated a group of people in front of him. In the dim light, he could see the children. At least 20 of them in the just visible light. They were all dressed in nightgowns that looked tattered and torn and stained with something dark. Their hair was long. Every single one of them looked like they had not had a haircut since birth. Some of the children were almost completely obscured by the length of it. Every single one of them did not appear to have taken a shower or a nice bath in their entire life. Mr. Mays told us that this is the most terrifying part of the story, that none of the children were moving. They were all just standing, staring, most of them only visible from the faint light reflecting off their eyes. The whole group was paralyzed with fear for several seconds when they heard what sounded like an animal in the distance yelping. The way it was described was like the sound of a dog crying, multiplied by 10. This spurred the group to life. Just as the children began to step forward, his friend grabbed the injured one and lifted him out of the room and out into the hallway in an instant. Mr. Mays took another second to move, difficulty finding his bearings. He reached to his left to attempt to find a wall to lean against and ended up finding a handle. He pulled hard, never losing vision on the children. He bolted for the door as soon as he noticed what he had grabbed onto. A shower head protruded from a cement wall, reaching maybe a foot into the room. There was something leaking from it, but it was too dim to tell what it was. He realized that it must have been leaking down on him, but he didn't care. There were now children stammering towards him as the animal cried in the distance, and his friend was now seriously injured. As he left the room, he made a point to emphasize that he could make out several more shower heads along the wall near a single dim bulb. And that's why I called them the showers, Mr. Mays told the class. I was transfixed, sitting as far forward as my desk would allow, bracing for more. I slammed the red door behind me, he said, and ran through that hall faster than ever run before or since. I made it back to the car and we drove like a bat out of hell. A couple of students snickered at the use of the word hell. When you're out there trick-or-treating tonight, make sure you know exactly where you're headed. And don't go to any abandoned farmhouses. I mean, there aren't many around here, but you're all smart kids, except Jerry. The class laughed. The mood lightened as the bell rang for a passing period. Mr. Mays turned the lights on and thanked everyone for listening, reminding them that papers were due next week, and he told us to have a safe Halloween. Students were all abuzz with theories about the story they had just heard. I bet it was some crazy Nazi hideout, said one girl. I think they were all ghost babies that were killed by a dog, said another. Couldn't theorize in the slightest. I was caught up in the moment. The way that Mr. Mays had told the story and the detail that he had included in it left me feeling that we didn't get the whole story. Billy Mays here with Nazi ghost children. Is that what you want? Chat. I'm trying to be spooky. Be scared. Scary. A couple days later after... Oh, by the way, March of the Mice tomorrow if you're watching this live. If you're watching this when it comes out on After Hours, you missed it. The thing should be up tomorrow for you to watch on After Hours, and then the edit should be done soon after that. A couple days later, I stayed after class and asked him about how it really ended and what happened to his friend. He laughed and he said his friends were fine, and honestly, he whispered this part, it's probably to do with the kind of drugs they were on at the time. Mr. Mays winked at me as if to say, don't tell anyone about the drugs bit, kid. And I smiled and left. I lived in that town for another couple of months and then was rapidly moved halfway across the country to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I twisted the story told around campfires as I got older. And it was always a hit, but I changed the ending. I let the friend die of blood loss or get him dragged away by the children. It wasn't until college that I got a chance to meet Mr. Mays again. I went to college in northern New York, not for any reason associated with the story. College was a fun time for me, continuing to be the same sort of ham that I'd always been. It wasn't until sometime around my junior year that I ran into Mr. Mays at a bar that I frequented. Initially, I couldn't be sure that the person I saw laying his head on head buried in his arm at the bar was Mr. Mays. The only trait that grabbed my attention was a sweater that he used to wear on his birthdays during class. It simply read, "I'm the birthday boy." I told my group of friends to grab a table and I would join them in a second. I walked over to the man at the bar. "Mr. Mays?" I said, as the man looked up. The man took a second to look at my face before he smiled, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Hey there, son. How you been?" I could smell some strong whiskey on his breath. His cheeks were flushed. He looked me in the eyes, the look in his eyes told me he was 3 sheets to the wind and was probably had no idea where he was. "Mr. Mays, it's Jack. I was a student of yours for a couple semesters about 6 or so years ago." His face changed a bit. A genuine look of recognition set in. He took a calmer tone, smiled. "How you been, Jack?" We talked for a solid 20 minutes. When I told him what I had been doing the last several years, he told me apparently he was still teaching the same school and the same old shtick, as he called it. I asked if everything was all right, and he said that he was good as they were ever going to get. It took me a while to realize that, as an adult, that we were both having a conversation with another adult. Every time I had spoken to Mr. Mays previously, there had been a student-teacher relationship. But now this guy was just a guy that I was having a drink with, a friend in his bar, or at a bar. My friends eventually left, and I continued to drink with Mr. Mays. He told me all about his divorce and his kids, things that I would never have asked or cared about previously, but now I cared. He was a real person to me, not just some idol anymore. He was some guy who had real problems, not an infallible teacher like I once thought he was. It had been several hours before I had even brought up the story about the showers. I told him about my history about urban legends and scary stories, and he just laughed when I mentioned that story that he had told us years ago. He almost seemed uncomfortable. He finished his whiskey, signaled for another, and then he turned to me and got very serious. "Listen up, Jack." That's me, is getting into character. "Listen up, Jack. I don't know why I kept telling a story year after year." His words were slurred. "Or hearing was messed up." His words were slurred, or my hearing was messed up. We both were sufficiently blissed at that point. "That was what my therapist told me to do when I was younger. I had people to tell it. Had to tell people it. I had to come to grips with it or some shit." He took a big swig of his drink. "Wait, your therapist?" Mr. Mays laughed heartily and looked at me. "Of course, Jack. You say something like that wouldn't fuck up a person?" I was confused, but smiled nonetheless. Things had gotten very strange. Thank you for the 8 bits, orthogonal caster. That was pretty good, Bert. I mean, you said we were all on drugs or something, right? Like, nobody was terribly hurt? You were all okay, right? He almost got a cartoonish with his sadness in the next several seconds. "Of course we didn't, Jack. Why do you think I'm here now?" I was puzzled, quickly filled with 1,000 questions that I wanted to ask him, but I let him carry on. "Tim, you didn't make it, Jack." He laughed. His laugh turned to tears. "Fucking took him, they did. I don't even know. Cops just told us we were drunk, he had wandered off and got taken by the wildlife. He didn't know. He didn't see it, Jack." I was absolutely stone-faced at this point. Mr. Mays was carrying along like I knew the actual story, but I didn't. His friend disappeared. I didn't know. I wish I had found the body, though. We could have shown them. He sighed. "That place, Jack, I don't know anything else to say. It's a bad place." He carried on for a couple of minutes more, about his friends and about the fun that they had had before they went on the trip, and I let him talk. It was only a few minutes later that his phone rang. "Hello, sweetheart," he whispered into his phone. "I'll be out in a second." He gagged. "Love you, babe." The person on the other end of the phone hung up the phone. Mr. Mays got up to leave. "It's been nice seeing you, Jackie. You got a good head on your shoulders. Make sure you use it." He began to walk his way out of the bar. "Mr. Mays!" I yelled after him. "Yeah, Jack?" He turned back towards me. "Where did you say the showers business took place?" "Where? Hell, didn't I mention it?" "Somewhere outside of Broken Bow, Nebraska. Fucking hell on earth, if you ask me." Mr. Mays walked out of the bar after waving to me, running into the wall before eventually finding the door. That was the last time I would see him. I'd never tell him the impact that he had in my life, or rather the impact that his story had on me. He'd never know about the trip that we took after graduation, almost mimicking the one that he and his friends made. He never would know about the things that he saw in that place were real. Why? Well, he died about a month later. His liver failed on him. It's all right, though. His family was with him in the hospital room. He got to die with people around him that cared about him. That's all I can ask for a man like that. I experienced that place too, several years later. That's where the story begins. The following is the story of how I came to found the showers, and why I will never go anywhere near Nebraska again. I'll finish the story when I'm sober. The memory is clear enough. This is part 2. Let me take a drink. I assume this was either on 4chan or probably 4chan based on how old it is. And that it's in parts like this. Yeah, just don't go to Nebraska. Fuck. That's the end of the story. Just don't go to Nebraska. Then the story ends. But no, we've got part 2 here where he goes to Nebraska. Fucking. If you live in Nebraska, leave. If you have thoughts of going to Nebraska, don't. Name 5 things about Nebraska. Nebraska is fucking hell. I've never been there. I'm making this assumption based on a creepypasta I'm currently reading to you guys. Nebraska fucking sucks. Part 2. I'm awake now, semi-sober, and ready to finish this for you guys, the internet, and whoever cares to hear it. Thank you for the 1,000 bits there, Muffin to plus. Better pasta, please. This one gets good. I remember this one being good. You can do Russian sleep experiment or like Lavender Town syndrome or something in a minute. But I mean, this is a good one. I remember this one being good. I remember this one creeping me out. Maybe it's just because someone better than me was reading it, but it's a good story. I'm awake now, semi-sober, and ready to finish this for you guys, the internet, and whoever cares to hear it. I didn't find out that Mr. Mays had passed until a couple months after the funeral service. Initially, I was going to go seek out his family in order to send my condolences. But it wasn't as if me and Mr. Mays were best friends or anything like that, so I refrained. Continued through my college career and graduated a year after our bar meeting. Graduating with English as my major wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't exactly something that landed me any sort of immediate jobs after college. Now, I'd saved a pretty solid amount of money while I was in school. Sounds fake. And decided that I deserved a bit of a vacation, if you will. I took the spare cash, got together with my college buddy Steve, packed up, and hit the road, aiming for somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. I lived near Littleton, Colorado, when I was younger, and remembered loving that area, so the destination was as good as any. The trip was a success. We made it to somewhere around Estes Park, Colorado, and found a cheap cabin that we rented for about a month. Thank you for the 1,000 bits, Muffin. The pasta seems meh. Yeah, I remember this one being good. Hold in just a little longer. I know the last one wasn't great, but one of these ones that I remember will be good. The trip was a success. We made it to Estes Park, Colorado, and found a cheap cabin, which we rented for about a month. The days were filled with lounging, hiking, journal things that involved little to no work on our parts. After our rental was through, we packed up and headed our way back east. Sometime during this trip, we had met up with a couple of Estes Park natives in one of the local bars. We typically never really hung out with them or anything like that. We just had conversations now and then over drinks and food. And one night, these guys were paying their tab, packing up to leave awfully early. And they usually were there until the wee hours in the morning. We questioned them about it, and they told us they were headed to go to a little get-together with some of their friends of theirs. And they invited us. Having nothing else to do, we hopped in the car and followed them to the party. Captain Hungry Spy, thank you for the 45 months of support. I think Russian sleep experiment is next. It's a short one. The party itself was fairly low-key. It was ultimately inconsequential to the story. However, the important thing about this was at some point during the night, we were all sitting around the fire, swapping ghost stories. And at this point in my life, I wasn't as much of a ham as I was in my younger years, but with a little bit of encouragement, I started a couple of stories that I remember telling from my youth. Eventually, I made it to Mr. Mays' story about the showers. Every time I had told it after hearing it from Mr. Mays, I had spiced it up a bit. But out of some sort of subconscious respect for my former teacher, I went straight into the version that he had told my class in the sophomore year of high school. The group enjoyed my stories for the most part, but the showers being a mutual favorite among the partygoers. Steve and I left the cabin around 5 in the morning, and he asked me about that story on the drive home. I told him about Mr. Mays, the class, and my love for everything horror-related and whatnot, and he suggested we try and find the place on our return trip to New York. Initially, I was reluctant, simply because I didn't like aimlessly wandering through Nebraska for days, looking for some old farm building that was probably demolished at some point. But a couple of days before we left Colorado, I told Steve that it sounded like fun. We weren't going to be able to get another trip like this in a long time, so I figured we might as well make the best of it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought of it as a little tribute to Mr. Mays, a guy that, in retrospect, helped me realize that I wanted to be a writer. One fucking banger story, and you want to be a writer. Damn. Auntie290, thank you for the sub. 5 months. That's very cool. We'll read a couple shorter ones if we still have time. Anyway, we left Colorado and made the long, boring, and barren drive to Broken Bow, Nebraska, or Hell on Earth, as Mr. Mays had put it. We found a motel in town and hung around for a couple of days, venturing 100 miles or so in any given direction each day after that. I remember Mr. Mays telling us that it was somewhere outside of Broken Bow. I don't think he got any more specific than that. We tried asking the townsfolk if they had any information about the showers. We were usually met with blank stares or eye-rolling when we told them exactly what this place was. The only person who seemed to know anything about it was an older lady who worked at a gas station outside on the outskirts of town. I don't recall her name, but the woman was just one of those cheerful old people, very helpful, generally interested in anyone who had to say to her, or interested in anything that anyone had to say to her. Steve had started talking to her at checkout, and she asked about her license plate, commenting about the fact that we were very far from home. We had nowhere in particular to be, so Steve and I ended up talking to this woman for about 15 minutes, at which point we brought up our hunt for this place known as the Showers. Initially, the name didn't ring any bells with the woman, which made sense, seeing as Mr. Mays had given this name its name after his experience there. But when I began to describe the details that I remember from the story, the friendly old woman interrupted me. Her tone was not scornful or mean in any way, but she suddenly became very terse and deliberate in her words from that point on. People don't deal with anything related to that sort of business around here anymore, she told us. It was all a long time ago. Following her statements, she attempted to be cheerful again, excusing herself to the restroom, wishing us all the best on a return trip to New York. Why would you do that? Just be like, yeah, it's fucking... That's a fairy tale. It's not real. Go home. You know? If you're like, yeah, it's real, it is scary, don't fuck around with it. Like, these idiots drove all the way from another state to fuck around with it. To hell. Anyway, Steve and I returned to the car without a word. Both of us were thinking about what the lady said. Again, she didn't seem to be angry. She just didn't want to hear another word about it. We were driving back to the hotel before Steve said something. I mean, if I had to live in a place associated with an urban legend or something like that, I would totally mess with anyone who'd asked about it. He said, I mean, eventually you just get tired of people asking about it. You try and scare them to get them to shut up, wouldn't you? I agreed with Steve and kept driving. That would be the other thing to do. But the whole experience wasn't sitting right with me. If this was some well-known legend of the area, why did no one in the town seem to know about anything about it? But I managed to shrug it off. Mind you, neither of us were scared of finding the showers. This little excursion on our road trip was more like a scavenger hunt to cap off an overall relaxing vacation. Steve and I were basically like tourists, hunting for a site at which a famous movie had been filmed or something like that. Went into the whole situation with little to no expectations and fleeting hope that we'd be able to find the place. We spent another day in Broken Bow before we took our next trip out to find the showers. Nebraska isn't as terrible of a place as people make it out to be, but it really isn't all that exciting. It is as terrible. I've decided that Nebraska sucks. I have no idea how many people that watch my channel are from Nebraska, but get out. Run. The real horror story is that you live in Nebraska. Just start walking. Just start walking in any direction that's out of Nebraska. Isn't as terrible of a place as people make it out to be, but it isn't all that exciting. We found a bar and spent some time there. It was really just the extent of our activity on our day off. Fuck you too. State tier list? Well, I mean, Texas is going to be on the bottom. I've said this before. Anytime that Texas is trending, anytime there's any news from Texas, it's not like someone from Texas made great strides in curing cancer today. It's always some bullshit. We have good barbecue, and that's about it. Anyway. Good barbecue, good burgers. Shit weather. It was 7 in the evening when we came upon a small but thick forest. I use the term lightly, but Nebraska, this place seemed like an oasis. The trees were full and thick, shrouding most of the insides in darkness. The sun was setting, and even though we had run into a few of these random crops of trees, we agreed that this one showed more promise than any of the others. There really wasn't a road, but there looked like there was a path where a dirt road might have been at some point, so we drove along that. If the car could handle Rocky Mountains, a dirt path in Nebraska would be no trouble. So we moved slowly and carefully along this trail, making sure to clear any fallen trees or rocks or in the road that would render the car useless. When the sun finished setting, it was pretty dark in a place during that. It was pretty dark in this place during the day, but it was when night came that it was something else entirely. I had the inkling at some point that we'd found the right place, but I didn't want to jinx it, so we continued forward. I didn't realize at the time, but the little bits of light that managed to penetrate the canopy of this miniature forest made it actually look like the tree branch was trying to grab the car, just like Mr. Mays had mentioned in his story. I'm still convinced he made up the part about the animal eyes, though most aggressive creature we saw in the woods was a dead rabbit on the side of the trail. It didn't have any obvious signs of death. It just looked like it had simply laid down and never bothered to get up. We drove around in the darkness for quite a while before we found a clearing. We had to move several smaller clusters of branches out of the way, but right in front of our exit was a giant... Our exit was a giant, dead monster of a tree. There's no way we were moving this one. So we got out and turned on the bright headlights in hopes that it would illuminate the area in front of us. There was a feeling of excitement, mixed strangely with fear, when I finally saw what lay 50 feet beyond the clearing. There, lit partly by the headlights in the tree, or from the car, and a little bit of light from the crescent moon, was what appeared to be an old barn house. It was a typical farmhouse. It was larger than other barns that I had seen in films. It didn't seem to have any crest. Basically looked like a small warehouse. I wasn't even sure what it was at this point, if this was the place that we were looking for, but it was definitely the closest we'd come. I moved through the brush until we got about 20 feet from the entrance, at which point all the growth seemed to stop. I don't know if the owners had done something to soil, but the whole structure had a border around it that was clear of any sort of plant life. I approached the entrance of the building, a large sliding door, as Steve came up behind me with 2 flashlights in hand. So you're going to run off into that place in the dark? He laughed. I gave a half-hearted chuckle and grabbed one of the lights. Mine was little, but a pretty bright flashlight. It was kind that hikers would most likely fashion to their backpacks just in case if they were stranded at night. It worked well enough. I grabbed the metal door with both hands, holding onto the flashlight with my mouth, and gave it a tug. I moved it slightly, creaked a bit. But there's no way I was doing this by myself. Steve came up behind me, set his flashlight on the ground, and grabbed the door. I said, 1, 2, 3. I pulled the door open with all we could muster, but once we had managed to move it a couple inches, it must have latched back onto its track because it slid very easily, stopping hard with a loud and echoing thud when it was completely open. Steve picked up his flashlight and walked behind me. I was already moving aside. Inside the structure was exceptionally bare, almost troublingly so. Wasn't sure how far from the nearest home or small town, but there wasn't even the slightest bit of evidence that anyone had been in this building for years. There were no broken beer bottles or empty bags of chips. There wasn't even animal droppings or eager plants that managed to grow here. The room was expansive, larger than your average farm, but not the warehouse-sized monstrosity that I had believed Mr. Mays had described in his story. I'm sure that it was simply a holding area for farming equipment or something similar at that point. Disappointed, I wandered near the entrance while Steve ventured into the expansive dark. I was running over the details of the story in my mind. Something stuck out like a sack of bricks. In Mr. Mays' story, there was a silo near the barn. I ran outside, my eyes adjusting easily because it was at least it was brighter outside. I looked in all directions, running around the perimeter of the building. Surely if there was ever a silo in this place, there'd be some evidence of it. But despite my hopes, there was nothing but a cluster of thick bushes on one side and brush and dirt everywhere, the forest that we'd come from. I walked back into the building, frustrated and tired. Steve was still excited, eagerly running around inside the building. Even if we could just find a shower head or a pipe, then we know it was true. He just kept looking with me. I didn't want to ruin his excitement, but I had told Steve the story many times. He obviously didn't realize that this just wasn't the place. This building was weird, yeah, but it was out of place and oddly pristine. There wasn't the location of the showers. I let him explore a bit more before I called him over. This is probably as close as we're going to get, man, I said, but this isn't it. Remember the silo? His face went from excitement to disappointment in an instant. Much like a child who didn't get the presents that he wanted on his birthday. I patted him on the shoulder. Still pretty cool, though. I mean, we still get to tell the story of people that we found it. I was reverting to my old habits quickly. No, like the beer and the chips. Like, if you're... None of you live in a tiny town? The abandoned ass weird place, that's where you fucking drink. It's where you go and get drunk and eat chips. Not that I've ever done that. That's why there would be, that kind of stuff there. Anyway. I was very quiet when I was in there alone. Wait. Steve laughed. Yeah, man, I guess we could. It's definitely creepy enough. Should we get some pictures as proof? I agreed with him. I'm going to go grab the camera real quick, he said, and he bolted out of the entrance of the building. I was left alone in the building. It was quiet, very quiet, when I was alone in there. I could almost hear the faint sound of Steve running through the brush and to the car. But once he was far enough away, everything was quiet. I remember not even hearing the wind or the chirping of crickets as I walked deeper into the dark. Flashlight in hand, I was convinced that there had to be something. As I approached the far corner of the room, a sound of my feet scratching against the dirt was suddenly interrupted by a soft, hollow thud. I stopped trying to figure out what it was. I put my foot hard down against the ground and heard it again. I saw him one more time and realized that the floor that I was standing on was covering something hollow. I walked to the wall of the room, carefully at the floor, trying to spot any holes or gaps. As far as I know, it was solid ground that this thing sat atop of. So I was convinced that I had found a hatch in the basement or something. I could hear Steve coming back to the bush. Steve, come here! It's a hole! As I went to say the word hollow, it's hollow. Oh, I see. I hopped a little bit, hoping to recreate the sound that he would be able to hear upon entering the door. It was that second that my feet made contact with the door that I felt it give out beneath me. The memory of the fall is fuzzy, but I do recall hearing wood splinter. I remember seeing the light from Steve's flashlight falling away into complete darkness. It wasn't a long fall. I must have fallen in a terrible position because I know that I had lost consciousness for several seconds at least. When I woke up, I was staring at a bright light. For an instant, I had thought that I was approaching the fabled light at the end of the tunnel. I was angry at myself. You died in Nebraska, Jack? Well, you know how you do know how to fuck up. My self-deprecation in the afterlife was interrupted by the sound of Steve's voice. Jack! Jack! Jack, can you hear me? Dude, please wake up! Please wake up! He screamed. I managed to lift my head off the floor just enough for him to celebrate. The pain from my head was immense, but it was outweighed by the pain shooting through my knee. I knew I had a concussion, but the pain in my knee was so much more pressing. I looked around until I found my tiny flashlight, and I sat up and reassuring Steve, I'm okay, I just hurt my knee. Bumped my head, too. Really hard. Thank fuck, man. I thought you were dead. Imagine that. Dying in fucking Nebraska. It'd be awful. His words made me laugh a little, but I stopped myself. The slightest shaking hurt my head and made me incredibly dizzy. I guess a rope? Said Steve. What? I asked quietly. Should I go get a rope to get you out of there, or do you see a ladder? I looked around the walls that sat in front of me. They were smooth cement. There was no way I was climbing out of here. Yeah, go get a rope, I told him. It's buried under all this stuff. It's buried under all of our stuff. I think it might be in my red climbing bag, but I'm not so sure. Steve nodded, telling me to hang in there, and that he would back in a little bit. It ran off. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. After the sound of Steve's feet scraping along the floor above me faded away, I was able to hear hear that buzzing that occurs in total silence, intertwined with the pulsing in my head. I pushed myself over to the nearest cement wall and braced myself against it, resting and breathing deep in an attempt to calm myself down. The cement was unnaturally cold on my back. It was summer, so I only had a t-shirt on, but it felt like ice even through that. Again, this observation was primarily made after the fact. In the moment, it felt damn good to lean against something. I sat there, waiting for Steve in the underground basement. I began to feel uneasy. I felt like an idiot for falling down here. I felt the pain from my injuries as well. That all seemed to fade away into one emotion in an instant when I heard what I could only identify as breathing, somewhere to my left. I convinced myself that my injured mind was playing tricks on me for a few moments, until my mind decided to rapidly replay Mr. Mays' story. When I had heard it in the classroom years before, I was impressed that I was scared, but now, sitting in the dark, in the middle of Nebraska, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. It couldn't be summed up by the word fear. As I sat there, I felt an all-encompassing dread. I pointed my flashlight to my left, the direction in which I heard the sound. The right didn't reach the other wall. It was too far away. I was comforted to see absolutely nothing there. I breathed deeply for a few more seconds before I could hear a noise in the darkness. It was quick. Thank you for the 1,000 bits, Muffin. It was quick, but I can't be sure that I think I'm going to go and thank everyone who subbed and stuff from here on out after the story, because we're getting to good bits. I breathed deeply there for a couple more seconds before I heard another noise in the darkness. It was quick. I can't be sure that it wasn't my own body moving around without noticing, but I thought I heard that scraping sound not 10 feet in front of me. It sounded like the noise your feet make when you're walking across a dirt-covered floor. Before I could react, I heard breathing again in my left ear, closer this time. There's no way this wasn't real. I hadn't seen so much as a spider web in this building. Now I'm convincing myself that something was next to me was breathing. I was angry at myself for getting so worked up. I told myself that a human brain is just constantly hallucinating. I told myself that while in silence or darkness, the brain will make up sounds to fill the gap, or make you see things that aren't there, channel my inner skeptic in order to calm down, and it worked. It worked until I saw a flash of something in front of me. I can't be entirely sure what it was, but I heard the accompanying sound of feet across the floor. It began to swell with dread. I decided that the best course of action was to turn off my flashlight, assuming that if they couldn't see me, they couldn't get me, whatever they might be. I turned off my flashlight and was left in total darkness. The bulb of the flashlight faded as it cooled. I put it in my pocket, simultaneously pushing back against the cold cement wall in an attempt to stand. I managed to get up to my feet, foot. I found that I couldn't stand to put any pressure on my injured knee. I limped over to the corner and hummed to myself, attempting to break the deafening silence. I called for Steve as loud as I could manage, but I heard no response. He probably was back in the car, still hunting for the rope. There had to be a ladder or something somewhere. I continued to hum, and my heartbeat, which had been beating almost out of my chest, I slowed to a manageable rate. I moved again along the cement wall, keeping my whole body against it and the weight off my injured knee. I traveled what I guessed to be 10 feet when my head made contact with something in front of me. I tumbled to the ground. My concussion must have amplified the pain because it was blinding. I reached both my hands to my forehead when I felt something warm and wet on my fingers. I searched for a cut somewhere on my forehead, but I couldn't find one. I desperately searched for my flashlight as I sat up, trying to get my back against the wall. I grabbed my light in my right hand, bracing against the wall in the other. I turned it on and pointed at the darkness where I was lying. The floor was wet, but the dirt had muddied the color of whatever liquid it was. I tried to get my eyes to focus on the puddle, tried to convince them that it was my blood when I saw another drop fall into the puddle. Words lack the ability to describe the way I felt when I heard the drip noise again, and saw yet another tiny ball of the liquid fall into the puddle. I think I knew, even then, exactly what the source was. But in least trying to convince myself that I was wrong, I lifted the flashlight up and pointed at the source of the liquid. I stared back at me was a pipe that protruded at least a foot out of the cement wall. The metal was rusted and cracked. Little bits of the liquid began to seep from them. At the end of the pipe was a simple shower head, aimed towards the ground. You know that feeling when your stomach drops? In this case, I think mine literally did because I vomited immediately. It got all over my shoe, but it wasn't the least important at the time. I ignored the pain in my knee and shuffled along the wall as fast as I could. I heard noises, but I couldn't be sure if it was just the sound of my own movement or something around me. I managed to duck under the shower head, the one higher up the wall. It seemed to be leaking the same liquid as the other one. I felt like I was moving along something infinite. Every now and then I would duck or to move under another metal bar, another shower head. They began to pour more profusely. The liquid was too thick to come out easily. The room began to smell. I remember immediately that Mr. Mays had described it. I grabbed my shirt and put it over my nose, trucking onward. I didn't stop for the smell for an instant. It smelled like vomit. It smelled like shit. It smelled like burnt hair. It smelled like rot. I was still moving against the wall when I felt something like some sort of outlet. I hit the dirt ground hard, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The pain still managed to break through. My flashlight was still in my hand. I aimed at it and examined my surroundings. Sitting in front of me was a doorway. There was a door there. Though it looked aged now, it had a nice design on it. The doorknob and a knocker that looked like a snarling demon. The red paint from it was flaking off and falling to the ground in front of me. I clumsily rose and busted through the door, narrowly missing a piece of sheet metal that was hanging in front of me. I was crawling now. There's no way I could run. The walls and the ceiling were lined with metal, the kind that you would see on the roof of a farm, large pieces of wood seeming to brace the sheets, holding this makeshift tunnel together. I couldn't risk sliding against it that might cut myself on the metal or hitting the wood and causing a cave-in, so I crawled. I pulled myself for what felt like miles, running into walls every now and then because the path seemed to curve like a snake. I had no idea where I was in relationship to that hole that I had fallen in. But I told myself that there was an exit at the end of this. Had I not been crawling, I would have surely hurt myself worse. There were parts of the tunnel in which the ceiling dropped down maybe 3 feet above the ground. If it hadn't caved in because the ceiling had still lined it, someone had built it like this. This, again, in hindsight, didn't care at the time. I kept telling myself there was nothing behind me. I swore that I heard feet scraping only a few inches behind mine. My jeans would brush up against my legs every now and then, making it feel like someone was touching me. I mean, even now, I can't be completely convinced myself that there wasn't. I crawled and crawled until I reached an upslope. With joy, I looked ahead of me. There was a cellar door. The door was made out of wood. I knew this because I could see through them. Just to be sure. I couldn't be sure, though. But I thought it might be the light from the car headlights. Besides all that, I was just so immensely happy to find the exit. I crawled all the way to the door and threw my shoulder into it. Budged but didn't open. I began to scream, my throat seared with pain. The most I could manage was a harsh crying noise. The sound of it sounded like a dying animal. I collapsed in exhaustion and pain. My eyes stared up at the slits of light before me. I was so close to being out of here. I could taste it. The moment the silence that it was in that moment of silence, defeated, that I heard the noise that was, without question, something moving in the tunnel. Something that sounded like it was being dragged across the floor. It would move, pause for a second, then move again. I had nothing left in my stomach left to throw up. I began to gag. I gathered myself slightly and tried to steady my hands enough to focus the flashlight into the tunnel. What I saw, I can still not rationalize. I know what I saw, but I can't convince myself that it was actually there. I can't stop telling myself that I was hallucinating. I saw a child in a dirty sleeping gown. The gown was stained with something dark and brown, the occasional splashes of deep red. The child was extremely frail, like in those pictures that people might see of a Holocaust victim. I could only make out one eye, brightly reflected in the light of my flashlight. In between huge tufts of long, dirty hair, it reached down beyond the fingertips of the child, which were caked in dirt. The girl or boy, I'm not entirely sure which, moved towards me with difficulty. It wasn't breathing hard, but it seemed every movement of its muscle took every ounce of strength that the child had. The thing froze me, though. The thing that froze me, though, was the eye. It was only visible because it reflected my flashlight. But even that glint, I could feel anger or deep hatred or something like it. This is the point where the English language really lacks the right words for the situation. I could tell this child meant me harm. Whether it was hallucination or not, the thing was getting closer. I started to cry. It was getting closer and closer when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, Jack!" whispered the voice. It was Steve, I was certain. I tried to talk back. I fully intended to say, "Open this up and get me out right now." However, given my current state, I'm sure I sounded like garbled nonsense. I clawed at the door. I pushed at it with everything I had, finally breaking eye contact with the child. And as I did, the flashlight rolled down the slope, coming to rest somewhere near the child's feet. "What do you see?" the voice asked. "What are you talking about?" I closed my eyes. I remember hearing a reply of, "Just look at it. Just tell me what you see." My own screams of frustration drowned out. I was mumbling like a maniac when the voice told me calmly, "Rest for a second. I'll get it." The statement took me a second to settle in, at which point I closed my eyes tight. "Steve, just do it, please. Just please open it. Please," I whimpered. "Just get me out of here." My voice was beginning to get louder. "Steve, goddammit, just open the fucking door." I opened my eyes for a split second to see nothing but the black hair dangling in front of my face, a small glint of light in the mess of tangles. I slammed my eyes shut and screamed with every ounce of energy I had, "Open the fucking door!" The door opened behind me, gave way, and I fell into the dirt, taking in a breath of fresh air. My eyes were still closed, but the first thing I did was scramble to find the cellar door and close it. And once I had done that, I took deep breaths and opened my eyes. I saw the barn in front of me, illuminated by the headlight of the car. My head was still pulsating with pain. I was covered in dirt and liquids that I didn't even know the origin of. My knee was, in the very least, dislocated. But despite all that, I was out of the tunnel. I took a deep breath and buried my head in my hands. "Steve, why didn't you just open the fucking door?" I waited for a response, but none came. "Steve, seriously," I began. I was fucking clawing, screaming for my life, I said. I looked behind me. My stomach must have been on the verge of falling out of me at this point because I shifted again. The only thing behind me was a large mass of bushes that I had seen while examining the perimeter of the building. I was angry. "Steve, this is not the fucking time. Come out of the bushes." I was ready to stand up when I heard a yell from the front of the building. The flashlight bobbed up and down in semi-darkness. Steve was running into the open door of the structure, yelling my name and telling me not to worry. I must have lost consciousness at that point. When I woke up, Steve was standing over me, desperately trying to wake me up. His words were almost incoherent, at least to my ears. He helped me to my feet, and we began to walk to the car. As we walked, I saw my flashlight just sitting outside the cellar door. The light was fading. Steve brought me back to the car, and we drove to the nearest hospital. I was asleep, but he told me that the drive was around for an hour before he found the main road. I don't think I ever told him the full story. I believe he thinks that I was just injured from the fall. He never really asked about it. We didn't stay in contact for much longer. It's not like we deliberately parted ways. We just stopped hanging out after that trip and went our separate ways. I've never been able to fully understand what happened that night. There's so many things that I can't explain. I can explain away as being hallucinations, but there are still some things that don't make sense. Showerheads were there. They were leaking something. The door was real. The tunnel was real. Most everything else I can be semi-rationalized if I can convince myself that I had a very bad concussion. A very, very bad concussion. But one thing that I couldn't have imagined was that cellar door was locked, and then it wasn't. I am still as skeptical as I've ever been, but I believe in what happened to me in the showers. I'm not a hermit or some social ba-da-bop-bop-bop. There it is. Someone was asking, am I going to say that? I didn't even know that word was in here. Well, there you go. Because of this, I drink a lot. I'm still functional, but I never returned to Nebraska. No one will ever be able to convince me otherwise. I don't watch horror movies either. There's absolutely nothing entertaining about being so desperately scared. That's it, really. No typical ending for the story. I was changed by my experience. Yeah, but there's no way to change anything about it or fight back against it. I can't even convince myself that I was just seeing things. Believe me, I've been trying for years. Prior to this, there was no real way to find any information in the showers. The legend didn't exist outside of the classroom of Mr. Mays. No one told stories like this to keep children away from a certain place or scare them. It just wasn't known. I guess that's really the whole point of the story. I want people to know firsthand what this place was like. Maybe it's just Junk's rationale or some kid inside me wanting to spread those kinds of stories again. I don't know. And I don't care. But it's out there now. For people to mold and warp to their needs, and most importantly, to finally get out of my head. It's getting late, and I'm going to need another drink. Cheers. That was the story. Kind of gives me Silent Hill vibes. I don't know about y'all. It was definitely a 4chan story, considering that I had to ba-da-bop-bop-bop, that one bit. Muffin, thank you for the 1,000 bits. I don't know if I thanked you for that 1,000 bits or not. I'm pretty sure I did, but either way. The word was the R word. It's not a word that's used anymore. It used to be a socially acceptable word in psychology. Not so much now. Not so much now. Now it is used by edgelords on the internet who have no personality. Thank you for the 1,000 bits, Muffin. Well, what do you guys think? The word that got replaced by autism, it's not autism. Different one. But you're in the right district anyway. It's one that I'm like, for the sake of, yeah, that's the one, Dustin. All right. It was good until the slur. I mean, like, I think a drunk would probably say that word. I don't feel like that's, like, out of character. It's like, yeah, it's, yeah, the word is Redditor. I'm sorry. No. It got better in the second half. I feel like the first half was just build-up. Lavender Town Syndrome is a classic, but I don't think it's, like, scary. I think it's funny. If I recall correctly, the Russian sleep experiment I recall being good. Is it long? It's kinda... It's a little bit shorter than the one I just read. I remember that, The Wireman. Godzilla NES. Would you be up for... I've heard that there is... I think you were mentioning it last time, that there is a some attempt to make the Godzilla NES game. And, I think it's sort of like how they did that with Pokemon Black Edition. So what I'm learning is, like, things that used to scare me as a kid. I think part of it is the way... So, some of y'all know this. Probably everyone here knows this. Horribly dyslexic. Horribly dyslexic. So late at night, in order to listen to stories, I would... And don't ask why I decided to fuck myself up like this, but this was something that I would do. Because the YouTube didn't exist at that point, and I wanted to listen to horror stories, I'd find... thank you for the 100 bits, Muffin. I would get, like, Microsoft Sam. I had a Apple... What was it? A MacBook? And I had, like, a text-to-speech mode. And so all the stories I would listen to were told with text-to-speech. And there's something about the text-to-speech, the Microsoft Sam voice. Microsoft Sam read. There's something about it. Like,
What I saw, I can still not rationalize. I know what I saw, but I cannot convince myself that it was actually there. I can't stop telling myself that I was hallucinating. I saw a child in a dirty sweeping gown. The gown was stained with something dark and brown, with occasional splashes of a deep red.
that voice used to scare the shit out of me.
Penis, penis, penis.
I got a 404 for that.
Penis, penis, penis.
Oh, you don't wanna say this one?
Penis, penis, penis.
No, that's not. I
penis,
put it.
Penis,
No,
penis.
I put a new one in. You got to read the new one.
I like big cocks, big chunky cocks with lots of hair.
There you go. It's great. Everything's funnier with the Microsoft Sam voice. He used to be afraid of it because of Creepypasta. I would listen to them at like midnight. I think this is when I was 21. I listened to them at midnight. I would get fucked up on 151, and then I would try and do art. And that just led to me making really bad art and scaring the shit out of myself and giving myself nightmares. Thank you for the 100 bits, Muffin. Should we try Russian sleep experiment? I think a lot of people mistakenly believe that this one's good. Or this one's real. Let's try this one. It's a classic. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using experimental gas-based stimulant. They're kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor the oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was highly toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones in and about 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water, and toilets. There's enough dried food to last all the 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects had largely complained having been promised falsely that would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 50 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noticed that they continued to talk and about increasingly traumatic incidents in the past. The general tone of their conversations took on darker aspects after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternatively whispering to the microphones and the one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected that this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers posited that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior was how the other captives reacted to it, or rather didn't react to it. They continued to whisper into the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The two non-screaming captives took the books apart, smearing page after page with their own feces and pasting them over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering into the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure that they were working, since they thought it was impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive, and in fact the amount of oxygen for 5 people would consume a very high-level strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, researchers did something that they said they wouldn't do to get a reaction out of the captives. They used the intercoms on the inside of the chambers, hoping to provoke any sort of response from the captives. They were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We're opening the chamber to test the microphones. Please step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." To their surprise, they immediately heard a single phrase in a calm-voiced response. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out amongst the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately the voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for their life of their loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened, and the soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder and louder, and so did the soldiers after they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state of any of them in life. Food rations for the past 5 days had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chests stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking a drain, allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never actually determined. All 4 surviving test subjects had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of their flesh and exposed bone in their fingertips indicated the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds would indicate that most, if all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal regions below the ribcage of all 4 subjects had been removed. With hearts and lungs and diaphragms remaining in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tracts of the 4 could all be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they were ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of these soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but many of them refused to return to the chamber and remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died, having his throat ripped out and another was injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed. How the fuck did he do that? And having his leg artery severed by another subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives if you count the one that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him and proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of morphine derivative and fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arms of one doctor. When heart was still seen to be beating for 2 minutes after he had bled out to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it had stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone within reach, and just repeated the word more over and over and weaker until he finally fell silent. This one's I'm not a doctor, but what? Why does this story suck? I remember this story being good. The fuck are you talking about? Like, I'm like, all right, yeah, they're drugged up. That's why. Okay. I remember a version of the story where it was like they're recreating it. They're aristocrats. Oh no, was this a true story? Yeah, it kind of went to gore porn. Like, we're not done with it, obviously, but I'm just... What the fuck? No, it's not the end. There's still more. This is a bit cheesy. Surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begged for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operation room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back in his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had prepared for him in the surgery. He fought furiously against the restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out for him to be put under. He managed to tear most of the way. I mean, what the fuck does it matter? He has his organs outside his body. Why do you gotta put him asleep? He seems fine with it. You don't need to just be like, listen, we'll give you the gas, but I gotta put your organs back in, all right? We'll make a deal. He managed to tear most of the way out of the 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding his wrist well. It took a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under. The instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subjects that died on the operating table, it was found that the blood had tripled the normal levels of oxygen. The muscles that were attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in the struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force of his own muscle had been exerted on them. Yeah, just shoot these guys. Fuck this. Like, I've been listening to more recent, like, ones, and I'm like, these aren't good. But then, like, is this actually the Russian? Okay. Oh, there was a movie in 2020. Yeah, that'd be all right. Hold on. What the fuck? Okay. I'll keep reading. Okay. Where was I? The second survivor had been the first of the group of the 5 to stop or start screaming. His vocal cords had been destroyed, so he was unable to beg or object to surgery. He only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head, yes, when someone suggested reluctantly that he try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for an entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to recover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it shouldn't be medically possible for a patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting with the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. Yeah, I think if someone's like everything was outside their body, they're probably dead, right? The surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk and struggling. Assuming this would be something of drastic importance, the surgeon got a pen and a pad fetched so that the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well. Though they had been injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation, the surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation with the patient's laugh continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared the systems in an enormously short time period, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were asked again. They were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers asked them why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: I must remain awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what happened if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. They're the KGB, so they're fucking evil. They do fucked up things, like fucked up experiments. Sorry, I should stop adding my own little, like... The only remaining subjects that could speak simply started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as the ones who had just died from falling asleep. The commander had given them an order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, and then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed the gun at the remaining subject and was still restrained to the bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. I won't be locked in here with these things, not with you, he screamed at the man strapped to the table. What are you? He demanded. I must know. The subject smiled. Have you forgotten so easily? The subject asked. We are you. The madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what hide from you in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go into the nocturnal haven that we cannot tread. Researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly chucked out. So nearly free. Wow. Fucking sucked. If they had done that ending, but not had him, like, rip out his guts, like, I shouldn't comment on the story while it's going on, but it's really hard to fucking take seriously. I remember this one being great. This was a fucking classic. Why does it suck so much ass? Like, emaciated, like, they just stopped eating and they ate one of the guys. Like, cool, great. That's good. All right, go with that. And they're like, what the fuck? And then, they start doing research on him and they try and, like, put him to sleep, but they don't want to be, like, that would be great. The part where they gutted themselves, that was weird. And it didn't make sense. Because I don't believe that. Like, the rest of this, I'm like, all right, yeah, some fucked up experiments happened in World War II. Yeah, uh-huh. Okay. Okay, Lavender Town Syndrome is really short, so we'll read this one. I mean, we're just gonna get all the oldies but goodies. Some of them are goodies. The showers held up. The showers, I still was like, ooh, about it. They wouldn't injure themselves to stay awake. Sure. Yeah, let's get some more schlock. It's got a picture of Lavender Town as seen in red and green. I should probably turn off like the rain sound effect for this. Hold up. Can I just here, hold up. Let me get some YouTube repeater. Or just there we go. Here we go. Perfect. The Lavender Town Syndrome, as also known as the... Wow, that's really loud. Holy shit. Lavender Town Syndrome, also known as Lavender Town Tone, or the Lavender Town Suicides, was a peak in suicides and illness in children between the ages of 7 and 12 shortly after the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan back in February 27th, 1996. Rumors said that these suicides and illnesses only occurred after the children playing the game reached Lavender Town, whose theme music had an extremely high frequencies. That study showed that only children and young teens could hear, since their ears were more sensitive. Due to the Lavender Town tone, at least 200 children supposedly committed suicide, and even more developed illnesses and afflictions. Children who committed suicide usually did so by hanging or jumping from heights. Those who did not acted irrationally and complained of severe headaches after listening to the Lavender Town theme. Although Lavender Town now sounds completely different on the game, this mass hysteria caused by the first Pokemon game released. After the Lavender Town incident, the programmers had fixed the Lavender Town theme music to be at a lower frequency, and since children were no longer affected by it. One video appeared in 2012 using special software to analyze the Lavender Town music. When it played, the software created images of the unknown near the end of the audio. This raised controversy, since the unknown didn't appear until the Generation 2 games, Silver, Gold, and Crystal. The unknown translate to leave now. There is also said to be a beta version of the Lavender Town. It is said that the beta version of Pocket Monsters was released to some kids to test the game. This video has the beta version of Lavender Town. And it's fucking... It's just the same song again. I think they just pitched it up. Okay, anyway, you get the point. Yeah. If you look up Lavender Town Syndrome, immediately, like... This one adds the spectrograph sounds into it somewhere. What if, you want Nightcore? We could play Nightcore or Lavender Town. Anyway, that's a thing. I can slow it down too. I can make it super shitty. Oh, that hurts my ears to listen to. Yeah, we're gonna stop that. Anyway, that's a thing. God, I'm fucking disappointed that both of those were like, eh. Was this one? Is it okay? There's an ad for porn on the sidebar here. Has there ever been a creepypasta about dementia or mental illness of the like? Yeah. The grifter? Depends on how long it is. Oh, the rake. Oh, the rake. Dude. The rake. Okay, we're gonna have to do the rake, but the grifter is right here. The grifter is an alleged video that was first mentioned somewhere on 4chan's X image board. That was like the paranormal, like creepypasta. I used to hang out there a lot. It was like I went to X, F, and occasionally V. Oh, wasn't there a spoopy man named Jeff the Killer? Yes, there was. I listened to that one recently. It sucks ass. It's really bad. Watching it was said to be a soul-rending experience, far more horrible than anyone could imagine. The image to the right is said to be contain screenshots of some of the scenes from the video. The few that watched it are said to have been killed in their own homes, with only one thing in common: a strange doll hidden somewhere in their homes. The message by the end of the video in constructed internal auxiliary language Esperanto says, "The child, now a young man, is still alive and lives in a local shelter whose name is not given. He never spoke and is still as catatone." It's just oh, here's images of it. It's just a fucking like naked ass baby. Like grainy, shitty looking like baby. The grifter. I wish I'd never seen it. Fuck, I feel seriously disturbed. I'm reading the 4chan comments now. So you guys, okay, just hear rain. There you go. Have a little bit of rain sound. I wish I'd never seen it. Fuck, I feel seriously disturbed. Like ruined something deep in my soul. I'll never be the same. Fuck. Damn. Does anyone have a link to this to the rapid shit of it? I've been wanting to see it for a long time, but I can't find it anywhere. My friends who watched it there were never the same again. Trust me, you don't want to see it. I hope that isn't you, Vic. Fuck you, OP. I almost forgotten about that shit. Thanks. I guess I won't be sleeping tonight. There's a video posted back here in 2008. I don't know exactly what it is because I never had the balls to watch it. Everyone who saw it complained about having nightmares and not being able to describe it. Most of the people don't even talk on YouTube originally, but it got taken down pretty quick. Might be able to find an RS of it. Well, it wasn't snuff or anything like that. Apparently it was just some weird audio-visual thing, something moving in the background, creating this really unnerving feeling. People reported getting sick, having nightmares. Spelled wrong. Apparently, some even killed themselves. I don't know if anyone could confirm that. It was really weird, though. I'd rather not talk about it. Let's just say it was the worst 2 minutes of my life. I'd rather fap to 3 Guys, 1 Hammer 1,000 times than ever watch that shit again. Worst mindfuck ever. No, that wasn't the right one. The one I saw, it was hard to describe. There was this dude in the background the whole time. Apparently he was the grifter, and there was a bunch of shit going on in the front, like a sink full of maggots or something, and paint on the walls was literally melting or peeling off and falling. The whole thing reminded me of that movie, The Begotten, but on DMT and times 1,000. Truly nightmarish scene. Very real, in color, super dark and grainy, very fucked up. The rest I still can't remember, but I don't want to. Fuck! Why'd you have to remind me? I don't want to remember that part where he's holding the dog that's crying like a human baby. Just holds it by the neck midair the whole time. Fuck! Fucking nightmare fuel. Seriously, that video changed my life. That's it. Kuklui, thank you for the 19 months at tier 3. Yeah. This one sucked. It's an oldie. I just remembered Candle Cove. Okay. Tell me Candle Cove is still good. Okay. So he actually he's like, yeah, don't post this anywhere. Okay, cool. You know what? That's fine. Let's see. The Rake. This one I remember not being that scared of, even still, back then. But, yeah, it comes with this image. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Fucking, yo. Look at how jank this is. Ooh. Ooh. It's definitely real and not photoshopped. Woo. The Rake.jpg. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little to no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused on a rural New York state, and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with creatures of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, a collaboration had accumulated nearly a dozen documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of the group and was able to get some excerpts for their upcoming book. In early 2006, suicide note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain that I've introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, I once again woke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice. I looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Lynn, I have prayed for you. He's spoken your name. Journal entry, translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when they're close to mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand, I will not sleep. His voice, an intelligible text. Mariner's Log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again at the request of the Rake. From Witness in 2006. 3 years ago, that's a huge fucking jump. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family on the 4th of July. We were all exhausted for a very long day of diving, so my husband and I had put the kids to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him up in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he got out of bed. When he turned to face me, I gasped and pulled his feet up. He gasped and pulled his feet up from the edge of the bed so quickly he almost kneed me and knocked me out of bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting for the darkness for a half second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was under somewhat of an assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering. Peering over his arm. I read that wrong, and I could not stop laughing. Just the thing you wanted. A Scroot landscaping rake. Oh, thanks, eBay. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, and then quickly crawled in a flailing sort of motion right along the side of the bed until it was about less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds. Or probably closer to 5. It seemed like a while. I just looked at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hall, leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the line switch, planned to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got into the hallway, the light for the bedroom was enough for me to see it crouched and hunched over 20 feet away. It turned and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch, and on the wall I saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs, and my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "I need more night bugs." He was the Rake. My husband drove his car into the lake that night. While rushing our daughter to the hospital, they did not survive. No shit. Being in a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first. The local paper took a lot of interest as well. However, my story was never published, and the local television news never followed up afterwards. For several months, my son Justin just stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to come home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature, now referred to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 4 pages, and it was never mentioned again. A ship's log that explained nothing of the encounter, saying that they were only told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There are, of course, many instances where the creature's visit was a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night. Every night for 2 weeks, I would scan through the sounds of me rolling in my bed each day when I woke up. And by the end of the second week, I was quite used to the sound of sleep while blurring through recordings at 8 times normal speed. This took me almost an hour every day. Yeah, it would, at 8 times speed. Do you know what that would fucking sound like? It would sound like bullshit. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is I've heard it before. I believe I know that it spoke when I was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. That was alright. That one didn't go super over the top with it. Like, all that's, like, reasonably believable. Like, I'm gonna believe that over guy rips out all of his organs and he's fine. You know? Like, that story sucked. I'm sorry. That didn't age actually that bad. I actually remember this one sucking. It was first story to, yeah, I mean, like, you know, it all seemed like a reasonable level of, like, and it's got, like, the good hallmarks of good horror, where it's like, you know, thing in your house, you can't get it out, it's gonna hunt you forever, it's hanging out there. I legitimately thought that this one was gonna be worse than the Russian sleep experiments. Better than Memories, yeah. Yeah, it was legitimately better than I remembered it being. No excessive blood. Just killed some random kid and then, like, they died on the way to the hospital. Sure, I believe it. You're freaking out. Your kid's dying, bleeding out. You just saw a fucking weird-ass monster. It's good. That one was alright. We're gonna have a creepypasta tier list. The subtlety is good. Let's see. This one apparently sucks. Retail Apocalypse. Alright. I want current pasta of the month. Okay, this is the creepypasta of the month. This is a current, recent creepypasta, I guess. What about generating creepypasta with AI dungeon at some point? Ooh, that could be good. AI dungeon has gone to shit lately? What? Alright, so this is what a contemporary creepypasta sounds like. Let's go with that. This is Another Hungry Mouth. No idea what this one's about. No idea if it's any good or not. Let's go. Constance would not tell anyone who the father was. Not when her mother cried, nor when her father yelled. Even when her older sister Emily sat on her bed and held her in her arms, rocking her gently. Constance was 4 months pregnant when she told her family that, and was already beginning to show. Emily was furious at herself for not picking up the signs earlier. Baggy clothes, Constance was preferencing over her usual tailored look, her out-of-control appetite, her strange secretiveness. It all seemed so obvious now. Still, how could anyone have expected to guess this? It's Constance, after all. Constance was the meekly obedient. Constance the meekly obedient. Constance the prim and proper. Constance the chronically shy. She's supposed to be the good daughter. And then, of course, there's the other thing. But I thought you didn't even like boys, Emily pressed. Constance wrinkled her nose in distaste. I don't, she replied emphatically. But I wouldn't exactly call them a boy, she added with a sly smile. Emily jerked away in shock. What? She cried. Constance lifted up a hand to her mouth and stifled a giggle. How old is this guy? Emily asked, unable to keep a stern edge out of her voice. I don't know, Constance confessed, her smile suddenly fading, beginning to wring her hands. Pretty old, I think. You think? Constance shrugged. Connie, who? No, Constance yelled, so suddenly and loudly that Emily gave a startled jump. Constance reached and grasped Emily's hands tight in her own. "Emily," she pleaded, "please don't ask me that. Please, I swore I'd never tell." Emily snatched up her hands away. She could feel the anger rising in her throat like bile. "Connie, if you're protecting some creep..." Constance laughed. Emily didn't see what was funny. "It's not like that," she insisted when her fit of giggles subsided. "It's more like..." She paused and stared off somewhere into the middle distance over Emily's shoulders. "It's like, have you ever had a secret that you didn't want to tell anyone because it would make it less special, like less yours?" Emily nodded slowly, though she wasn't all that sure that she had. Wasn't that part of wasn't the fun of having secrets and telling it to somebody? "It's like that," Constance continued. "This belongs to me. I don't want to share it with anybody." "Not even me?" Emily wheedled. But Constance just continued to stare at nothing, a soft smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The last few months leading to Constance's confinement were tense, to say the least. Constance's condition could not be kept a secret for long. In the way of small towns, once one person found out, this news spread like a virus, persistent, insidious. Rumors abounded about the identity of the father, and it seemed that no male with any link to Constance was exempt from having gleefully accusatory fingers pointed in his direction. Her schoolmates, her teachers, even her doctor. One particularly malicious gossip suggested that the reason Constance would not talk about the father was because it was our own father. When Emily heard this rumor, she tracked down the source, a pimply young boy in year 8. She delivered one devastating punch to his blemished features, earning herself a week of suspension, the boy a bloodied nose and a split lip. Things were even more strained at home. Dinners became a silent affair, with neither of the parents so much as glancing up from their plates to look up at Constance. Emily had to grit her teeth in rage that the familiar bond linked parents and daughter could be proven to be so weak. What surprised Emily more than anything was how unfazed Constance seemed to be about all this. Where every whispered slur or raised eyebrow caused Emily to bristle, Constance breezed through her days with her head held high, as though completely oblivious to the shame that her family felt, that people expected her to feel. Amidst all the murk and the mire and the casual cruelty, Constance glowed. Emily had never loved her sister more. When the child arrived and Emily was finally allowed to visit, she was dumbstruck. There's Constance, sweaty and teary-eyed, but beaming, in her arms, a tiny wrinkled form. Constance's son, James, Constance informed her without looking up. The fact that her little sister, her own Connie, had created this tiny person as if from nothing, filled Emily with a quiet awe. When Constance finally tore her love-struck gaze from her new baby and looked up, Emily saw that her sister's eyes were filled with tears. She felt a lump in her own throat. Sister's eyes locked, and they were both overcome with joy, so bright and so intense that they felt like it would last forever. It did not. Failure to thrive was the term the pediatrician used. And what amounted to that, despite apparently feeding normally, James was not putting on any weight. In fact, over the 12 weeks, James dropped to almost 200 grams below his birth weight. They were on all kinds of tests. Emily accompanied her sister and nephew in what seemed like an endless cycle to the doctor's office, in waiting rooms and consultation suites, where sympathetic people with stethoscopes about their necks spoke in hushed tones about things like caloric retention and metabolic demand. All Constance ever seemed to be able to say in response was, "Oh." As days passed, all Emily could do was watch her sister grow paler and more anxious. As James lost weight, Constance too seemed to diminish. She began absent-minded and vague, forgetting tasks partway through, often trailing off mid-sentence. She drew in on herself, until she had little more substance than her shadow. Emily wanted to help Constance, but it was like she could no longer reach her. With every day, Constance sank deeper and deeper into a small dark pit. Into some dark pit. However hard she tried, Emily could not follow her. All the tests came back negative. When every result Emily saw relief fighting with anxiety in her sister's drawn face. So James didn't have cystic fibrosis or diabetes or hyperthyroidism. But what's wrong with him? This is just sad. Fuck. Emily was not sure what had woken her up. She lay there sometime in the early morning chill, staring blankly at the ceiling. A sense of dread slowly crept up on her, starting to feel the discomfort in her belly and the culminating dull thud in her breasts. It was then when she noticed a yellow light seeping under her bedroom door. She rolled over to face the glow and noticed, as she did, that her alarm clock displayed 2:15 a.m. Too late for her parents, too early for Constance. Surely. Reluctantly. The fuck is happening? Reluctantly, Emily dragged her sleep-heavy body out of bed and shuffled towards the bedroom door. While she held it open, she saw the source of the light was not one of the other bedrooms, but rather the kitchen across the hallway. Grumbling to herself, Emily made her shambling progress towards the kitchen, where she found the fridge door wide open, humming slightly. Still groggy, she vaguely noticed the fridge's contents were in a greater state of disarray than usual. However, before closing the door and making her way back to the bedroom. Halfway down the hall, Emily halted as she heard a noise coming from Constance's room. A soft serialization. She recognized her sister's voice, but the pitch was too low for her to make out words. Emily began to move again, but there was something in the tone of the voice that emanated from the darkness of Constance's room that swayed her. A wheedling note edged with quiet urgency, and brought back a creeping dread that first dragged her from slumber. Connie? Emily asked anxiously as she opened the door. She heard no response, just a continuation of Constance's hushed whispers. Emily flicked on the light. Constance was bent over James's crib. It took several moments before she straightened up, blinking at the light, turned to face her sister. Emily stifled her own cry of surprise when she saw Constance's face. The girl's young eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and dark rings hung below them. It was not that Emily was taken aback, however, but the expression in those strained eyes. Startled, trapped, looked almost feral, instantly flickering across Constance's eyes, rendering the familiar features alien to Emily. It was Constance who broke the silence. He won't eat, she said to Emily, her tone desperate. I don't know what he eats. Emily's eyes darted down when she saw that her sister was clutching something tightly in her right hand, a lumpy mass that dripped onto the rug. So incongruous was the sight that Emily didn't immediately register. Was that a raw steak? Emily stared in mute shock while her mind reeled. What was Constance doing with meat? What was she thinking? She swallowed a lump in her throat and began slowly, soothing noises to advise Constance. Shush, Connie. She crooned, shush. Emily reached over to her younger sister. She took her hands when she saw they were trembling violently, in her own, surreptitiously removing the meat slab and placing it on the changing table. She glanced down at the crib and noted that James seemed to be sleeping soundly. Gently, she guided Constance back to her bed and persuaded her to lie down. Once she was beneath the covers, Constance began to weep softly. I don't know what he eats, she choked between sobs. Emily stayed seated on the edge of her sister's bed and stroking her long dark hair until she fell asleep. The feeling of uneasiness stayed with Emily through the next day. It was Saturday, and her friends wanted to go to the movies, but she blew them off. Her parents were both away for the weekend, and the idea of sitting in the dark while Constance stayed at home alone with James was intolerable to Emily. Instead, she spent the entire day just hanging around the house, unable to commit herself to any activity more than a few minutes. She found herself hovering around Constance, watching her critically. She didn't seem to get that image out of her head of Constance standing over James's crib with the lights out, clutching a chunk of meat. For her part, Constance behaved as if the previous night had not happened at all. She changed James and bathed him. She gave him formula and even played with him on the lounge room floor, tickling his feet and blowing raspberries into his too flat tummy. She would lift him up in the air and kiss his middle as if for a moment at least, she didn't notice the worrying concave of her son's belly. As Emily watched Constance, However, she could not keep herself from thinking that her sister's smile looked strangely painted on, that there was something more than fatigue beneath her red-rimmed eyes. Emily slept fitfully that night. Her sleep was disturbed by strange nightmares, although she forgot the content almost immediately after she woke, left her feeling shaky and disoriented. I think this is going to be like, yeah. When suddenly a wail from James pierced the night, Emily immediately sat up bolt right. She propelled herself out of the room, and almost before she had time to register what the sound was, she heard James's cries often, to be enough to be familiar with them. Could even tune them out most nights, but this was different this time. Those cries were too much, louder than normal, and strangely wet, as though the infant was choking on some fluid. Emily threw open the door to Constance's room. "Connie, what's wrong?" she gasped, feeling with each breath that she may choke on her own heart. She was in such a rush that she forgot to turn on the light as she charged to the door towards her sister. "I heard..." "Oh," came Constance's startled cry as she dropped something on the floor, a bloody kitchen knife. What have you done?" Emily whispered as she stepped towards Constance, then turned and ran up to the crib where James had stopped his piercing wails. Emily, shaking, stared at her nephew. There was a jagged red line that ran across the child's belly. What? Starting at the base of his throat and running all the way down to his navel. To Emily's horror, the gash began to gape, exposing the bloody red interior that protruded and the shattered remnants of James's ribcage, now just jagged fragments of bone. "Oh my God, Connie, what have you done?" Emily braced herself against the side of the crib as she fought off waves of nausea and disbelief. She felt her head spin. Her vision began to blur as her breath caught in her throat. She could not tear her eyes away from her nephew's twisted form. After what seemed like an indeterminate time, Emily's breath returned to her, though it was shallow and ragged. As her vision cleared and adjusted to the faint light that filtered through the open curtain, she realized that she had made a mistake. In her initial shock, Emily had thought the white shards of James's split torso to be ribs, but what she saw was not the case at all. They were teeth. Great jagged teeth, set in crooked sidewise mouth that ran most of the length of James's tiny body. As Emily watched, the terrible nether mouth began to open wider this time. From out of the impossible depths snaked a black slimy tendril that could only be a tongue. Letting out a strangled cry, Emily stumbled backward and then watched the tongue rose up out of the crib, flailing back and forth as it was tasting the air. The tongue reached all the way to the changing table and began to tap the surface, exploring. It was only then that Emily saw the rat, a fuzzy mound laying on the changing table, its head crudely cut off. As Emily began to watch, the tongue slid towards the inert rodent, and then, with horrible deftness, wrapped around it and lifted it off the table, pulling it back towards the crib in a horrible waiting maw. The tongue made a wet slurping sound as it retreated back into the crooked fangs. Somewhere behind Emily came a weak cry of, "Oh!" Emily had forgotten Constance was even there. Emily turned as she saw Constance standing there, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were white. Her moist, febrile eyes glittered in the dim light. Emily saw that there was no fear in her eyes, only wonder. "Oh, Emily," Constance sighed again, and then rapturously, "he looks just like his father." That was a good one. I like that. What the fuck? Yeah. You monster fuckers in chat are like, "Oh, that was sad. Now you get, this is what happens when you fuck monsters." That ended more cute than scary. Yeah, that was good. It ended before it got too weird. Like, it made you feel for this kid. You're like, the fuck is wrong with this kid? Because I was getting depressed. I was like, shit, is this just going to be like depression porn? And then the kid dies or like whatever. And I was like, it's got to be something about the dad. Like, what the fuck? was good. Yeah, I was like, man, what? It's gonna be like a. Thank you for the 1,000 bits, Muffin. Um, you know what? I think this proves that some of the older ones suck. Like, not that they suck, but they set a groundwork. You know, like the shower, it shows its age. You know. Yeah, it was a solid story. You know, I think people got to be better writers. You know, back in the day, it was just like, this is this fucked up thing that happened to me. Now you've got like stories like this. This is a good one. I'm gonna look for more recent ones that are good. I feel like a lot of more recent ones have the I'm a badass with a gun and I'm specialized to deal with shitty situations. Like I'm part of some spec ops thing. What's this creepypasta called? Another Hungry Mouth. It doesn't have an author listed. I would credit them. Um, uh, yeah. The Rake was okay. I liked it. Let me check and see if there's any new art, and then I think I'm gonna probably stop for the evening just to rest up my throat, so we can do some March of the Mice tomorrow. It's gonna be a shorter one, I think, but I think there's gonna be a lot of character building. I think there's gonna be a lot of lore. I think there's gonna be a lot of interesting new stuff to learn about the world. If you're invested in the world, it's great. If you're not, I think you'll pick up fairly quickly on what happened in the previous ones. So I don't. I've made this series where if you didn't catch the first two, you're gonna be fine. But I would recommend watching them anyway because I put a lot of love and effort into them. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I really do. If you guys did enjoy this, let me know. If you didn't, let me know. I mean, I guess I'll tell based on numbers on YouTube. It seemed okay. Anyway, we'll probably do Homestuck on Friday or something. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Brr.